Okay, great.
Great.
So the Faculty Write program, and also I am the Associate Director for the Language Arts and Media program, or LAMP. One of the things we focus on is the stories that we tell, the stories about writing and our writing lives. And a piece, it's not only how we write, but why we write, for whom we write, under what conditions do we write. And so we're going to be talking today about how do you do it, like how do you get it done. Prolific writer, as Lee has helped us to see all the many things that you've written, but also what inspires you to do this work, how you connect to personal experience and writing. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about how you started to connect your writing about war with your writing about climate change.
Right. So that's a great place to start, to sort of position the two things together. And it also gets into some questions of sort of how things get done. So I've been writing about war since I think 2009, 2010. I got out of the Army in 2006, spent a couple of years in school, and then started writing while I was still in graduate school. Thinking about other things, writing about different things. Got into Princeton, and my dissertation in the PhD program there was on World War II and American literature. So it's more thinking about war, but in a different way. And somewhere around there, throughout this whole process, I hadn't really been thinking much about climate change or about environmental issues. I'd been an activist when I was much younger. I grew up in Oregon, watching clear cuts just pop up, just appear on hillsides, and being there for the timber wars in the 80s was formative, and I was an activist in the 90s and was at the WTO protests in Seattle in 99. But after 9/11 and during my time in the Army and then after, those sorts of things sort of fell by the wayside as I was focusing more on issues of veterans issues and American imperialism, what war means in American culture, these sorts of questions. And the opportunity came up while I was working on my dissertation to go to Cornell for the School for Criticism and Theory, which is like, theory summer camp kind of thing. And took a seminar with Ian Balcom, formerly of Duke, right? On the Anthropocene, right? I didn't really know what this word meant, the Anthropocene. And I was interested in it. I knew it had something to do with global warming, and I was actually interested because, so it was on post-colonialism and the Anthropocene. And what I wanted to think through there was how to think about World War II, right? How to think about a giant global event that sort of overwhelms and exceeds the imagination. And it involves, disparate populations all over the world with hugely different sorts of impacts and relations, all kinds of biopolitical issues, geopolitical issues, resource issues. How to think about what it's like to be in that event, right, while it's happening. So I wanted to use global warming as a way of thinking about World War II. And it turned out to be remarkably productive in that way. But what also happened was, as I was doing the research, before the seminar and during, reading up on the contemporary situation with climate change, reading the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, World Bank reports, and reading books by scientists like David Archer and others, I realized that we're totally screwed. Things are really, really bad in terms of the situation with climate change, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and the very slim possibility, if there's any at all at this point, of being able to do anything about it to keep the planet from warming to catastrophic levels, and also finding out that experts all over the world, policy people, World Bank people, are are extremely worried about the effects that this warming is going to have on infrastructure and on economic systems and on governments and roads and populations, and it's all over the country. So, we're kind of looking at the likely end of civilization as we know it, meaning global carbon fuel capitalism. So I was like, wow, that's that's tough. Why did I go to grad school now? So I spent that summer in Cornell, walking the beautiful gorges and really thinking about that. And also thinking about it in terms of, World War II and war. And, I wanted to write something about it. I knew an editor at the Times, from writing for him as a veteran for some veterans blog stuff. They had Home Fires, a veteran series that Peter Catapano ran. And so I pitched an idea to him, like, I want to write about the Anthropocene. I want to write something about climate change. And for his philosophy book, because for the Stone, the philosophy series, I wanted to talk about it as a philosophical issue, because it seemed to me, for me, my experience at that moment was with climate change as a kind of existential crisis. Like, what do I do? And especially, like, if there's something there's some way I can contribute to making it better, work for a carbon tax, or help build Teslas or something. Like, I want to do that, but not really sure that there is much we can do to stop the warming. I think what we need to do, and this is the argument I make in Learning to Deny the Anthropocene, is learn how to adapt to it, learn how to adapt to the world that we inadvertently created. And so I wanted to write something sort of addressing climate change as a philosophical problem and posing it in those terms that we've probably already passed the point of no return, and we need to figure out how to deal with that as a issue, as a humanistic issue, as a philosophical issue, as a cultural issue. And he was like, well, that's great, Roy. That sounds interesting, but why should anyone listen to you? Like, you're not a climate scientist. You're not a recognized philosopher. Like, what's your hook? And I'm like, well, I'm a veteran. I can connect it to being a vet. I can connect it to Iraq. Because there's a clear, it's not just getting people's attention, it's not just a hook. There's a clear connection between, for example, climate change and the massive drought that has been affecting the Middle East since 2010, and has been a driver of the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis there. And as well, I can connect it, as I do in that piece, and in the piece I wrote for the Times, through having seen firsthand what it looks like when infrastructure fails, right? When a city the size of Houston or Washington, D.C. is hit with shock and awe, and no one's there to pick up the pieces. I've seen what that looks like, and it's grim. So I can connect it in those ways. And as I've gone on, the connection between climate change and the Middle East, and climate change and resource wars, and climate change and American policy in Iraq, and climate change and oil. I mean, all those connections were there, and they've just become more and more present and available to me. And also, this is just a minor thing, but it does wind up in the narrative. After coming back from Iraq, when I was still in the Army in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and my unit was put on alert and trained up over the weekend for riot control operations. We did all this training where we had to stand holding shields and smash into each other and all this stuff, and they didn't wind up sending us, but there was a moment where that felt close, and it's just another way that sort of my military experience connects to climate change, and the issue of the role of the military when it comes to infrastructure collapse and things like that, and conflict and so on. So those are some of the ways that it connects. And then I used my military experience and sort of that very dramatic scene of driving into Baghdad after the U.S. invasion in 2003 as a way of framing and framing for readers and bringing readers in to this idea that that's what the future may well.
Well, and I was, in one of the pieces that you had, I was struck by, you started with the imagery of Baghdad and what it's like and the destruction, and then you talk about the moment where you're watching Katrina unfold on TV. And you had a listener who could say, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Who are your trusted people who you can say, so I have this idea, but I'm a veteran and I have something to say about climate change, right? Can you authentically talk about climate change if you're not a scientist? Indeed, yes, but who can help you to vet those, to help you frame, make those connections and frame those conversations?
For a long time I depended on sort of sharing work with friends and peers. As I've gone on, I've come more to depend on editors for that sort of thing. The editors I work with now, I put out a pitch, and they take it or they don't, or sometimes they send it back. Again, for example, to look at the New York Times story. It was Peter sort of pushing back about, how do you establish your authority to talk about this issue? So then I had to respond to that, figure out a solution to that problem. And interestingly, even then, after that, I sent him the piece, and he was still pretty iffy about it for a while until one of the other editors, Simon Critchley, he's not an editor, he's a curator of the series, really pushed for it. And we went back and forth, Peter and I, on some minor edits on the piece, but he's a pretty hands-off editor. So I guess what I would say, I would say, thinking about these things, there's a sense, partly it's just experience, building judgment through experience and writing for the public. I think one of the best things that can happen to a writer for their writing is to be published, because then people respond and you see your work in a completely different way, and you start to develop a sense yourself of what might work, what might not, where you might be able to try something risky, or where you should hang back and just sort of rely on more traditional conventions of storytelling. And it's a balancing act sometimes, because sometimes the more radical or the more disturbing or the more unusual the kind of information or content you're presenting is, the more you want to rely on more conventional forms of storytelling to sort of ease people into this difficult space. So as a developing writer, earlier on, it was more friends and colleagues and peers. I was in the NYU Veterans Writers Group in New York for 3 or 4 years, and that was where I met Phil Cly and Matt Gallagher. We sort of had a great community there. We would trade work back and forth. We don't do it as much anymore. We rely on our editors, but we still sometimes read each other's stuff. Yeah.
So easing people in, I think, is very interesting, especially if it's provocative. You want to give them what's comfortable, and narrative conventions certainly can be one way to do that. And you've written about the role of fiction in helping tell stories about war. And I wanted to read one of my favorite sections where you use, because I am also an English person, so the Iliad, whenever the Iliad gets quoted, I get very excited. But in the piece, Why Fiction tells the truth about war. Do you want to see what I'm going to read?
No, I've seen it. I wrote it.
So how, especially especially the power of fiction, right? How this might be a way in. I'm really intrigued by this idea.
Yeah.
So you're right. To sympathize with the enemy and the enemy's child, to let ourselves inhabit states of being and ways of feeling, like the rage of Achilles that would destroy us in our daily lives. To understand how we tell stories about events and how those stories make us who we are, and to think through the problem of what it means to be human, thrown into a world beyond our control. We need more than history. We need more than what happened. We need the density, complexity, and imaginative sympathy that well-wrought fiction offers. Is that our great hope for climate change? Is to think about telling it through fiction rather than statistics or science? I'd just love to hear more about the potential for fiction to get us to ease into seeing the hard things.
Right. So I'm still not sure how fiction can do global climate change, right? So war is easier because a war is between, there's sides, right? There's a clear conflict. And the thing that I think fiction can do especially well is to open up kind of that intersubjectivity, this kind of polyphony where it's not one voice, it's many voices, and you can see how they fit together. You can see how, for example, from the Iliad, like I talk about in that example, how there's Achilles with the Greeks and there's Hector with the Trojans, and you can see how each of them, you can see the perspective of each of them, and you can also see how there's a bigger perspective that contains both of them. And I think if there's anything fiction, particularly like, long form narrative written fiction can do, it's that. It can bring us not just out of ourselves, but it can bring us out of ourselves in a way that we can see the world from multiple perspectives and sort of come to appreciate how there's a bigger truth there. And I think there's possibilities for that, in terms of climate change. It's sort of the bigger picture there gets hard to sort of. I guess with climate change, one of the things is it's hard to know where to stop. It's hard to know where the scale ends. People in theorizing and talking about trying to understand climate change have talked about we need to bring animals into our politics. We need to talk about parliaments of things and like what rocks have to do with things, and also we need to consider Timothy Morton down at Rice talked about hyperobjects and the way that we need to interact with objects that transcend our ability to conceptualize them as sort of single entities, like a tropical storm, or like global warming itself, or like like El Nino or something. And so, in this sort of way, on this sort of level, fiction runs up against sort of the limits of our capacity for narrative understanding when it comes to like, well, how do we tell the story of a hurricane from a hurricane's point of view and connect that to a rock, that's just sits there for millions of years or whatever, and then also connect that to humans that in a way that will, and do all of that in a way that's going to engage our emotions, right? Engage our sympathies as readers. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's just there's difficulties there, and I'm not sure yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and I think it's sort of a thing that remains to be figured out and opened up. A lot of the things that have been written, fiction involving climate change so far, tend to just be like people projected into a dystopian future, right? Great things, you know, Margaret Atwood's Mid-Adam trilogy, really interesting stuff. The most interesting fictional representation of climate change that I've read so far is Jeff Vandermeer's Area X trilogy, which tells the story of an ecosystem that is an alien being. An entire chunk of the Gulf Coast becomes this alien being somehow. It's not clear how, but it's a very interesting way to think through climate change and think through this question of scale and intersubjectivity.
So these are, like, first of all, I want to read the story from the hurricane's point of view.
Yeah.
I would love to read that story.
Yeah.
But these are all just big picture ideas, and you know, you wrote a lot of this stuff while you were a graduate student running a dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very interested in just a very practical how you wrote. Like, how do you manage these big ideas that have promise, but you're not ready to deal with them yet, perhaps? You're writing a dissertation, you're writing for the New York Times. How do you just logistically manage multiple projects at the same time that might be in various stages of completion?
Yeah.
Do you have a whiteboard? Do you have a list?
I don't have a whiteboard. I would often stick things up on the wall, though. That's important. Yeah, having a physical space, not just a desk, but like also like going out to the walls to be able to sort of objectify what the projects I'm working on is really helpful and important. You know, I mean, the main thing is I've been writing a lot, so you know, I tend to get up early and write every day, and that's hugely important to just have the practice and to keep coming back to it. With also with, you know, having that regular writing practice, and then added on top of that these moments of sort of binge writing where I have a deadline for a magazine, or I have a deadline self-imposed deadline to finish a dissertation chapter. So it's a combination of writing all the time and writing all the time.
Clearly this resonates with a lot of
Right.
folks. So would you say having a regular writing, like is your most important habit? Like, what would you say is your most important go-to habit to keep the writing going? Is it just writing every day?
No, it's writing every day, because without that, for me, things get lost in the, you know, the daily mix. What writing every day does is that it helps ground me in that project. I may not do my best writing at 5 o'clock in the morning when I get up, but I'm thinking about my project. And by thinking about my project every day, then my subconscious goes to work. And that's who gets all the credit in this stuff. That's where the interesting stuff happens, because then, you know, my subconscious is working on these things the rest of the day when I'm doing other stuff. And then when I go back the next morning, I can bring those thoughts to it. And it's super important, because also a lot of what I think are my best thoughts or most interesting thoughts about a piece come, you know, when I'm working with a project over time, right? So, you know, again, it's that sense of having it be a part of my life that it's just there, and I can go do other things, but it's still existing over time. And really, daily practice is, for me, fundamental to having that.
And do you focus on one project at a time?
Yeah.
Or is it today's this essay, tomorrow's that essay? Because that's also one of the challenges of
Yeah.
multiple projects is which one to immerse yourself in and for how long?
Yeah.
So pick a week. What do you do every day for a week?
Yeah, I've been very privileged to have the time as a grad student at Princeton and not have too onerous of teaching demands. So I've had a lot of my own time. And when it's been particularly, you know, when it's been the writing's been particularly heavy, like I have 2 projects going on at the same time or something like that, or 3, I'll just, I'll divide up the days of the week. It's pretty, I'll do 3 days on one project and 2 days on another. Yeah, and that way they're both there. It's not as great as having just one project, but it's the way to keep doing it. Yeah, and they feed into each other in interesting ways. That there's a real bleed from one project into the other that I find creatively productive.
Well, it sounds like they build momentum too, right? Because when they start kind of coming out in quick succession.
Yeah.
So have you ever been stuck? You ever had one where it just wasn't working for you? And if you did, we'd love to hear your strategy for getting unstuck.
I've had terrible moments of doubt and panic at times. Often, I mean, there's the moment in the early stages where like, I don't actually know what I'm doing, and how do I do this? How do I start the thing? And that's bad, but it's manageable. You just have to force yourself to write stuff, whether it sounds good or not, right? It's just like, you have to start like just spitting out whatever thoughts come into your head, and then eventually, and trust that you'll fix it in the editing. But that's not as bad as sort of the dead panic in the middle of a piece, or not quite in the middle. Like there's like 1/3 of the way in, this worry that like you're not making any sense and it's not ever going to come together, and it's just going to collapse, and all the work you've done is wasted, and it's going to be bad anyway, whatever. And the only way I figured out how to deal with that is to just keep going, to just keep writing. When I was in Baghdad, I often reminded myself of something Winston Churchill once said, which is, when you're going through hell, keep going. Just keep going, because
well, that's a heck of a writing mantra.
it's the only way out.
I think we need t-shirts.
Yeah. So, yeah, the only way out of a writing problem is through it. Just keep writing. You just have to trust. You just have to trust the process, and trust that as you pile up the pages, some of them are going to be good.
So I want to ask just one more question about your writing life before we
Sure.
open it up to all of us to ask questions. And that is, thinking about potential negative critiques of your work and how you might have handled them as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the How to Die in Anthropocene has received positive reviews, but some folks disagree with your ultimate "we're already dying" as maybe not the way to engage folks. And then critiquing American Sniper and the trauma hero narrative. How do you handle negative critiques, or how do you keep moving forward productively as a writer when it seems an uphill battle? I mean, I'm thinking about how veterans are portrayed in our current national politics.
Mm-hmm.
There's little complexity of
Yeah.
what a veteran is and how veterans are in our country. So how do you stay positive and focused when you have a negative critique, or when so much of the dominant narrative of either of those two stories is against what there's so much energy you're working against?
Right. Well, there's a couple different ways to answer that question. One of the first things I got published was this 5-part essay in the New York Times Home Fires blog. So it was this blog web thing, and it was just about. It was a long essay about what it was like to not really coming home from war, but getting out of the military, moving to New York, and what it meant to sort of be a veteran, and how I thought about that, and how I was carrying it forward. Very much a personal essay, but also, bringing in these reflections that I'd been, developing in graduate school at the New School. And very high profile. I think lots of readers, and lots of comments, but interestingly, at the Times, they moderate their comments. So the real wingnuts didn't make it through the filter, but still, you know, it's a very, and this was what I was sort of saying earlier, like one of the best things that you can do as a writer is just to get published wherever, anywhere, because when people respond, you realize, you begin to see, like, so much of the time even, like readers aren't even, they don't care about you. Readers are bringing their own experience to the text, right? They're bringing their own issues and their own concerns. You know, sometimes I think, you know, the best I can do as a writer is to not be misunderstood in the wrong way. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, not everything is necessarily going to get through. I'm really happy if 75% of what I feel like I'm trying to communicate gets through. But, you know, just like I'm happy if I'm not completely misunderstood. So there's always going to be. So this is one way to answer the question: is that, you know, is that readers are it's, you know, they're projecting onto you. They're bringing their own things. They're dealing with their own sense of text, and which is not to dismiss what they're saying, but to realize, you know, as with anything in life, like, you know, they're doing their thing, you're doing yours, and you're the one that has the forum, you're the one that published the thing, you're the one that has spoken, and so you can't let it get to you too much. And a personal, taking it out of the, you know, the interwebs and into sort of a room like this, I really welcome in pushback, because it's actually a chance to talk about the things that I've been obsessed about, and to the point where I need to write about it. So I really want people to talk, and especially if they don't agree with me. I love having those conversations. And then there's the other part, which is, you know, you're talking about my work like on the trauma hero and critiquing dominant narratives of veterans and war in American culture, and you know, how to think about sort of the impact of writing, you know, and that's a bigger question, I think, about how how culture happens and how discourses happen. I think sometimes very influential ideas can not be, sometimes they're not understood or accepted or integrated right away, and they percolate. Sometimes, you know, they percolate until there's a moment where, you know, the culture needs to hear that or wants to hear that, and it can integrate it. Or sometimes, you know, sometimes it's part of a conversation or a dialogue that helps shape a discourse. It's been very interesting, you know, being part of the forming veterans fiction discourse, and now being part of the Anthropocene discourse, to see how arguments shape up and how sides get formed. And, you know, I'm not there too. I I feel lucky when the things I'm interested in personally happen to connect with the things a bunch of other people are interested in. It's not necessarily, and it doesn't make me, it's no skin off my nose if it doesn't. I'm writing because I'm a writer, and I want to write, and I write to process things and think about them. And I want to communicate, and so I want to make my ideas understandable. But am I trying to transform? Am I trying to change everyone's minds? No. I'm just trying to put my thing out there, and it will either the conditions of the culture will be such that that idea will be useful for people and they'll want to talk about it, or it won't. But that's not really up to me. It's just sort of luck or random chance. or, you know, also a question of like seeing where conversations are going, right? And thinking about, you know, what's the next step, or what's 3 steps down from where this conversation is going, right? And how can I, you know, what's interesting there for me?
Well, and for me, it connects back to what you said at the beginning, which is climate change. What do I have to say? Right?
Right,
Like the so what
right.
question. And that's, as writers, finding your way in, right? That one piece that you can look at closely and hold up and say, okay, this is what I'm going to figure out and contribute to the world. And it's up to them, you know, they can accept it or not. I think that's really interesting to think about your particular way into the conversation.
I talk about this in the Anthropocene book. I sort of think of human culture as like bees, right? So when bees when they need to find a new hive, the scouts all go out and find prospective sites, and then they come back to the old hive, and all these scouts dance. They do little dances, right? Like that communicate the information about the new hive, like where it is and what the conditions are, whether or not, you know, whether it's sunny, whatever. And then all the bees in the hive start dancing with the scouts until you have all these different like giant dances going on. And eventually all of them dance together, or the majority of them all pick one dance and pick. Then they fly off to their new hive. Sometimes it happens sometimes that they can't pick one hive, and then you know, they'll split, and often one of those groups of bees or both will die. But usually, you know, they pick a hive and go. And so I think, I know this is like a reductive, mechanistic, you know, there's a lack of sort of reason in this account of how humans behave. But I think of it as something like that. There's, you know, we're all just bees, you know, vibrating on certain frequencies, and I got to do my little dance, and sometimes it'll be part of a bigger dance, and sometimes I'll just be off on my own.
Nice.
Yeah.
I love it. That and the work right through hell. Like I think those are very, very nice writing mantras. So what questions do you have for Roy about his writing life, about writing, about being bees in the world?
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, you said you have a quite structured day, right? You start in the morning writing. So how often are you going over your text you might wrote a couple of days before? And second of all, when do you start opening your text for somebody else, like wife or maybe like a partner or friend or whatever? So when is the point?
So those are great questions. One, so I often will start by skimming and reading parts of whatever I did yesterday, or, you know, whatever I've been working on, to sort of get my mind back in that groove, and also to start to do some editing, and also to warm the brain up, you know, so I'm not just diving right into like full, you know, creation ex nihilo. So often editing becomes a part of the process pretty much as soon as I generate a first page, right? So from then on, I'm looking back at what I've done as I go. It's, one thing that's important there is to not, for me anyway, it's easy to sort of, if I'm not feeling very inspired, I could just spend all day editing, and I can't let myself do that. I have to at some point start new work. But so that tends to be part of the process almost from the beginning. And in terms of sharing it with people, I'm very bad at I won't say that. I've had to work very hard to be able to hear criticism with equanimity and be able to in the writing process, right? Once it's out there, whatever. But in the process, I'm so wrapped up in what I'm doing. It's hard, and but I also, it's really valuable to get that feedback. And there's not like a hard and fast thing, but it's a matter of feeling. At a certain point, the text has to be sort of mostly draft. You have to have a draft, right? But I try to push myself to, I don't know. So there's this thing, right? So on the one hand, I want to push myself to ask for feedback before I feel like it's completely done, before I feel completely comfortable sending it out there, because I need the feedback while it's still in process. On the other hand, I also want to force myself to work through whatever problems are holding me up before I necessarily just turn to other people to try to solve the problems of the text, right? Oftentimes, like, I'll have something drafted in it, but there's something wrong. I know there's something that's not working. And it's easy to, at that point, to be like, well, I'll just give it to someone else. They'll tell me what's wrong, and then I can fix it. And it doesn't quite work like that. And I found that it's better for me if I can spend the time to figure out what's wrong to me. But at a certain point, you do have to give it to someone else. We're blind in a certain way to our own work, so you need that outside perspective. Yeah, that was a long-winded thing. Yeah.
So I have a question about research.
Yeah.
Because, it's obvious in nonfiction writing that research has gone into it. Although in the Anthropocene book, I was really, you cover a lot of ground in that little book. And so I wondered about whether you had anxiety about, certain things that maybe you say, I realize I'm oversimplifying this, or, this is a quick review of some really complex literature or whatever, but how you make that decision about, this is the thing that gets 2 paragraphs, even though I know 25 books have been written about it in the last year. So that kind of thing for the nonfiction writing. But then I think it's even more of a question for me about the fiction, and especially in this era now when there's so many people like you who are veterans who are coming back writing about war, and it often has a memoirish kind of feel to it, even though it's fiction, and everybody has the caveats, this is not about my experience, but I'm still, every time I read them, I'm thinking, I'm picturing Roy Scranton there, or I'm picturing Phil Cly as the person, or Matt Gallagher as the person, and even though, say, in Cly's, his is short stories, so there are multiple points of view, and so I'm always trying to figure out which one is really him, or, so I'm going to add another question to that, because I'm also curious about the decision making about, why fictionalize something that you've experienced? Because it does require the reader, I think it requires more work for the writer in some ways to get the reader to that point where they really do believe that it's fiction.
Yeah.
And so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
So this idea of research and fiction, nonfiction.
So on the question of well, I'll answer the second one first, because actually that's a little easier that way. So on the question of fiction, nonfiction, there's all kinds of personal reasons, I guess, or real-world reasons for writing a sort of romanaclé, like some sort of like fictionalized memoir, or just writing something that very much works on one's, works from one's experience. But I think the better reasons to do that are, as I said, as I was talking about earlier, sort of the capacity that fiction has to include sort of multiple perspectives, sort of polyphonic world. For example, Phil's short stories are an example of that, the different Marines. In my novel that's coming out in August, Warporn, it's three main narratives that are they're sort of embedded one within another, like Russian nesting dolls, right? And there's one that's very autobiographical about an American soldier in Baghdad, and then there's one about a young woman in Utah at a barbecue, and then there's one about an Iraqi mathematician in Baghdad during the invasion. And there's the imaginative work there is about trying to understand the bigger world that contains these different perspectives. And part of what can happen there is another thing that fiction can do really interestingly and really well, I think, which is draw attention to how we tell stories and what stories about things mean to us, to trouble our sense of trust and meaning in narratives. And I think something like, for example, right, Tim O'Brien's work in going after Cacciato, or the things they carried, is very much in that line where it's it's autobiographical, but the fictional conceit pushes it into a meditation. It pushes the text into being not just, well, this is my story, but a question of like, well, why do you want to hear this story? Why am I telling you this story? How do I put this story together? So I think that's another really, really great thing that fiction can do. And as you say, it requires another level of work. Like, you can't be just like, I went there and then I came back and this is what happened, right? There has to be a level of craft, and even, I think, even a level of sort of explicit artifacture. Like, you have to engage the reader in a different way, right, in order to really bring those questions out in interesting ways. But that's what I think fiction can do. And then when it comes to the question of research, I think even for fiction, if you're doing those things, if you're thinking about storytelling, or if you're writing from other people's perspectives, right, you need to do the research to get into that. And my experience in, doing research in academic ways and journalistic ways, and for fiction and other kinds of nonfiction, is that writing a personal essay, writing from my point of view, writing just about how I feel about things or my own history, isn't very demanding research-wise. Almost anything else, it takes an immense amount of work to do the research, and I found that I wind up having to, it doesn't quantify quite like this, but it feels like I have to have like 8 or 9 times as much research as I wind up using in the piece, right? There has to be, because you need that much stuff to be able to draw from, to find the right things to put the narrative together. And it's sad in the writing editing process to like leave great stuff on the floor because it just doesn't fit. There's so much. I'm thinking of the piece I wrote for Rolling Stone, and when I went back to Baghdad, there was so much stuff that I wish I could have gotten into that, but it would have been like the piece would have been 5 times as long if I'd done it all, and probably not as good. Lots of research. Yeah.
Okay, time for one more question. Make it a good one.
There'll be a question in here somewhere. I was interested in your initial comments and the 2 words, inadvertent creation of the situation we're in now. This isn't about the writing process. I'm interested in your insights on this Anthropocene kind of thing. In an attempt to understand more about Central Asia and the Middle East, I've been doing a lot of reading, including a lot about Baghdad,
Mhm.
which, sitting in the cradle of civilization, has had centuries upon centuries of not particularly civilized behavior. It's easy to think of the intersection of the Anthropocene thing and climate change. I'm more interested in the intersection of Anthropocene with war.
Mhm.
And what are your insights, because you've written about World War II? It seems to me that, talking about inadvertent, there was no real careful thought to the use of nuclear weaponry in World War II to save lives. And to what degree that represents people really saying, it really doesn't matter what we do, or we'll worry about it later.
All right. So I think, let me say on a broad scale, I think that, I mean, it seems pretty clear that global climate change is going to be what the Pentagon calls a conflict multiplier. It's going to drive conflicts. It's going to increase fights over water and land and resources, and we're seeing that now already in Syria and elsewhere, all over the world. You know, and when you look back, when you look at human history through a conflict or through a climate change lens, you look at the Little Ice Age and the end of the Little Ice Age in the 17th and 18th century, right? Period of notable conflict in Europe and elsewhere. And even you go back to you know, ancient Uruk and Sumeria, the beginnings of civilization, right? And you know, civilization, we can mean a lot of different things when we say that, but in the way I use it, I tend to just want to be as simple as possible and say it just means human culture based in and around cities. And from the beginning, civilization was probably arose as a response to climate change, as a response to drought and the need to collectivize agriculture, right? The need to organize many people in order to be able to work the irrigation, right, in a floodplain, right, in order to be able to have the, I'm not a, you know, farmer or a historian of ancient Sumeria, but the demands for sort of collective organization of social groups in order to be able to make sure that the canals get dug and that the irrigation happens properly and that the crops get reaped at the right time, right, in that area at the time was probably one of the forces that gave rise to cities as we know them. And also gave rise to empire, because as soon as they started, you know, as soon as these Sumerian, or as soon as the ancient, you know, Akkadians started building cities, they then needed, you know, needed to keep, or felt the need anyway, to keep expanding, to take more territory. So climate change and conflict are intimately wedded. And in terms of, you know, in terms of agency, the question of inadvertent creation of climate change. And I think, you know, the use of the atomic bomb in World War II is a great example of these moments where politics comes in interesting ways without there being a real sense of long-term consequences. I think you're right that there wasn't a great sense at the time of what it would mean generations down the line to introduce this technology. But there were political goals at the time, right? Ending the war with Japan, intimidating the Soviet Union, and you know, and then there's the question of of whether or not, would it have mattered if Truman hadn't used the atomic bomb, would someone else would the Soviet Union just have invented it 10 years later, and then the US would have had, and, it's just, we're limited creatures, right? Human beings, even human beings in very powerful positions, are still, sort of just complicated primates, right? Really limited creatures with limited foresight, limited ability to understand how these very complicated systems, very complicated geopolitical systems, climate systems, biological systems, how they all work together, and what's going to happen when we mix them up, right? And so even with the best of intentions, we still don't know don't really have a good sense of what consequences our actions will have. So that, even with, the best of scientific prediction and guesses along those lines, we're still, when it comes to the things we do, when it comes to our political choices, I think, we're looking into a fog. And so, I don't sort of, I'm just ending in the fog. But so this is where,
Fog of war.
yeah, well, so, and this is, and I tend to be pessimistic myself about, about our ability to have big solutions for things. We tend to be, especially in advance, we tend to be reactive as an animal, as a species, as beings. We tend to respond to problems as they come up, which, when it comes to climate change, suggests to me that we're not actually going to really get serious about it until it's too late. And I also fear that we're going to respond not from a position of worrying about all of humanity or what's best for the world, but from a position of worrying about how we can protect our resources for ourselves and our children, for whatever, wherever that we line gets drawn, whether it's a wall somewhere or, the border at the oceans or some kind of ethnic or religious or racial designation, however that we gets drawn, right? I worry very much that that's going to be how politics gets shaped in the next century, is worrying about us and our resources, which, of course, will just give rise to even more conflict.
Sadly, on that note,
On that show.
we have come to the end of our official time together. I want to thank you, Roy, for
Yeah.
helping us
Thanks for
learn more
having
about your writing life and your writing, but also to complicate our understanding of storytelling. So thank you for joining us.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.